Hey everybody, Red Diamond Stu Loyal back again with another video. Today we're reacting to another Anna Horror Stories. I got locked in my school Christmas party after dark. This video was once again requested, guys. Let's get into it.
It was a tradition at my high school that on the last day of school before Christmas break, we would throw a big party in the gym. There were snacks, music, Christmas-themed games, and at the end of the day, we would watch the Elf movie on a great big projector. Everyone wore pajamas to school that day, and there weren't any classes. It may sound childish, but it was truly something that we all enjoyed doing every year, and it marked the beginning of Christmas vacation. There were a lot of preparations that went into getting the gym ready for the party. There were banners, balloons, garland, wreaths, and a great big Christmas tree that needed to be decorated. About a dozen seniors, a few teachers, and I were on the decorating team. We came to the school the night before to get everything ready. I was in charge of decorating the tree, which was pretty important. Every year the tree had a different theme. This particular year, the theme was Candyland. We had boxes of candy canes, gingerbread cookies, and lollipops that were going to be hanging from the branches. I stood on a ladder hanging piece after piece for nearly an hour before I ran out of ornament hooks. I asked around to see if anybody had more, but we were completely out. My English teacher, Mr. Varner, told me that there were some paper clips in his office that I could use instead. They're on the top of my desk in a clear container, he told me before going back to blowing up balloons. I nodded and headed to his classroom, which was on the other side of the school. The school was very dark and so quiet.
Oh heck no, I would have asked somebody to come with me.
That it was almost creepy. I had never been at school at night before. Emergency lights gave off just enough light for me to find Mr. Varner's classroom without bumping into the walls. When I got there, I walked straight to Mr. Varner's desk and saw the box of paper clips right away. I went to pick them up, and there was a sudden bang. I spun around and saw that the door had been slammed shut. "Very funny," I called out sarcastically, thinking it was just probably one of my classmates trying to scare me. But when I walked over to the door and tried to open it, it had been locked from the outside. The only person who would have a key would be a staff member, and I knew none of them would mess with me like
Right, so who locked her in though? Dang.
this. Maybe a custodian was locking up and didn't realize I was in the room. I checked my pocket for my phone and groaned as I realized I had left it in the gym. I started banging on the door and calling out for help, but no one answered. I knew everyone was probably still in the gym, and there was no way they would hear me from there. I sighed. I guess I was just going to have to wait for Mr. Varner or someone else to realize that I was still gone and come look for me.
Wow.
I sat down at one of the desks to wait, wondering how much longer I would be trapped for. The thought crossed my mind that the rest of the volunteers might just assume that I went home and might not come looking for me.
The classroom ain't have no windows to where she could like open it and get out? Shoot.
What if nobody found me until school opened up tomorrow morning? Surely my parents would get worried and call somebody. Suddenly, I heard a strange shuffling sound come from the closet. A chill ran down my spine. Was there someone else in this room? Hello? Is someone there? I called out. Much to my shock, the doors of the closet burst open and a man with a long beard and tattered clothes jumped out. I screamed in shock.
Oh heck no.
And fear. "Who are you?" I asked him. He stared at me for a few seconds before finally answering. "My name's Cal. I squat here during the night. Beats sleeping on the streets. Been doing it for a few months and nobody's noticed. That janitor never remembers the back door by the gym," he said.
Oh.
I took a second
Be going in and out of the back door.
to process this information. "Okay, well, we're trapped. The door's locked," I told him. "No, we're not. There's a spare key in the bottom drawer of the teacher's desk," Cal said. I did not know where he could have gotten this information from, but I figured it was worth a shot.
Well, he's been there for months, so he probably knows the ins and outs of how to get in and out.
I walked over to Mr. Varner's desk, and after rummaging around in his messy drawer for a few minutes, I found the spare key. "Great," I shouted. "Well, I'm gonna get out of here," I shouted over my shoulder as I made my way over to the door. "No, you're not," Cal said, his voice completely serious. I turned around and Cal was standing directly behind me, holding a gun that was pointed at my head. I immediately put my hands up in shock.
Why is he deciding to keep her in the room with him?
"You know my secret now. You rat me out, and I won't be able to stay here anymore."
That makes sense. He don't want nobody to know that he staying in the school.
"It's a lot more comfortable sleeping in this nice and warm classroom than a park bench, and it's supposed to snow tonight," he told me. I stared at him in shock as I realized what he was saying. "Look, I'm not going to tell anybody I saw you here. I just want to go home," I told him, my voice shaking. "How am I supposed to believe you?" he answered, not lowering the gun. "Please, you don't have to shoot me. Just let me go," I said, tears beginning to fall down my face. Just then, I heard someone call my name from the hallway. Just as I turned to look and see who it was, a shot rang out and I sunk to the floor. It took me a moment to realize that the bullet had missed me. The next thing I knew, Mr. Varner was wrestling Cal to the floor while shouting at me to get help. I sprinted out of the room screaming at the top of my lungs. Once I got a hold of a phone, I called 911 while some other teachers went to go help Mr. Varner. He had control of the situation on his own, though. 10 years in the military had prepared him for taking down a homeless guy.
Oh yeah, Mr. Gardner knew what he was doing. He ain't need no help.
He kept Cal down until the police arrived and took him into custody. The school checked the security cameras, and sure enough, Cal had been sneaking in every night for months without anybody knowing. To this day, I'm sure if Mr. Varner had...
And that's the problem. These businesses with cameras, they don't really be checking them, until something bad happens. Y'all should be on top of that regardless.
...gotten there in time, I would have been shot dead.
A babysitter's nightmare.
One year I was home from college for Christmas break and was looking to make a little extra cash. My mom asked around for me, and it turned out that someone from her office was going out of town for the weekend with her husband. They had a little boy named Tony who they needed a babysitter for. The person would have to stay over at their house for 2 days, but they were looking to pay $100 each day. I sent them a text and said I would do it, and they sent me their address. I knew the family had money, but I hadn't expected them to live in a mansion. I pulled up to a beautiful, enormous white home that looked like it had been pulled out of a history book. It had an iron gate and huge pillars out front. I rang the doorbell, and the mother greeted me. She kept thanking me over and over again for coming at such short notice. She and her husband were going to New York for a kids-free couples weekend. "You have a beautiful home," I told the mom. She thanked me and explained that the house was actually around 200 years old.
200 years old.
They had parts of it fixed up, but they didn't want to do too much remodeling because of the special history the house had. I wanted to ask what type of history she was talking about, but she and her husband were already walking out the door after she handed me a piece of paper with instructions for the weekend. I made my way through the house to the playroom where Tony was sitting, surrounded by Legos. I introduced
Wait, the parents didn't introduce her to the son? Just go be like, well, here you go, here's the paper. Didn't even introduce the son to her, didn't even introduce her to the son. That's kind of weird.
Myself to him, and I told him I'd be looking after him for a couple of days. He was nice and well behaved. I could tell it would be no trouble babysitting him. When evening rolled around, I pulled the lasagna that Tony's mom had made earlier out of the fridge and popped it in the oven. Tony was still upstairs, and besides checking on him every half hour or so, there wasn't really much for me to do. I had spent most of the afternoon catching up on episodes.
I would have watched TV with him, played games with him or something. Why she let him be upstairs all by himself?
Of Gossip Girl. When I finished getting dinner, I called Tony to come down to eat. He quickly took his spot at the large, fancy table and began eating. The room was so quiet, and the only sounds were forks scraping against plates as we ate. For some reason, I felt like I needed to make small talk with Tony to fill the silence. I asked him about school and sports and what he liked to do for fun. When we got through all the normal topics of conversation, I was running out of things to talk about. Is it ever lonely living in this big house with no brothers or sisters? I asked. The question came out so fast, I didn't even think about why it could be upsetting to the kid. Tony looked at me for a few seconds before finally turning back to his dinner and answering me, "It's not so bad. Alexander comes to visit me sometimes and we play together."
Who's
he said.
Alexander?
"Oh, is Alexander one of your friends from school?" I asked Tony. "No," Tony answered. "Alexander is one of my secret friends. I'm not supposed to tell my parents about him," Tony answered. I shrugged this off, thinking he was just talking about one of his imaginary friends. That night, I tucked
Is it a spirit floating around in the house that speaks to him?
Tony into bed at around 9 p.m. and then went to bed myself in the upstairs guest room. I kept trying to go to sleep, but I could hear talking coming from Tony's room. I figured he was just playing with his toys. I tried my best to fall asleep, but once midnight rolled around and it still hadn't gotten quiet, I decided it was time to investigate. I slid out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway. Tony's bedroom door was open just a crack. I peeked inside and saw that Tony was decorating a tiny Christmas tree in his room. I smiled as I watched him position the star on top of the tree so that it was just right. "How does it look?" Tony asked out loud. After a few moments of silence, he said, "I think so too. I wish I could tell Mommy and Daddy about you. They would get you presents for Christmas." It was strange. It seemed like Tony was having a conversation with an imaginary friend.
Yep.
Eventually, I left him to it and just tiptoed back to my room. The next morning, when I was making French toast for Tony, I decided to ask him about what he had been up to the night before. "Hey, who were you talking to last night?" I asked, trying to sound so casual. "Alexander. He was helping me decorate my Christmas tree," Tony said simply. I decided to push a little further. "How long have you known Alexander?" I asked. "I met him the first night we moved into this house. He was lonely."
Yeah, he's a spirit that is connecting with little Tony.
"And wanted a friend. He's the first ghost friend I've ever had," Tony said, turning back to the cartoon that was playing on TV. I almost dropped the glass of orange juice I was holding. Surely he was kidding. Maybe he had a really big imagination, but I couldn't get over how serious he was when he talked about this Alexander person, and it was such a long name for a little kid to make up. I had never believed in ghosts, but if one were to exist, it would only make sense that it would be in a great, big, old house like this one. The rest of the day, I walked around on edge, jumping at every little creak the floor made. By the time night came, I was so creeped out, I was considering calling Tony's parents and asking them to come home early. I wanted to get out of that house and never look back, but of course, I had to wait for morning. When Tony's bedtime came, I tucked him in and told him goodnight. Right before I left his room, I decided to ask one more question. "Tony, did Alexander ever tell you what his last name was?" I asked. Tony answered right away. "Yes, his last name is Fredericks. Alexander..."
He about to look him up on the computer and see if he is the kid that lived in that house years ago.
"Fredericks," he told me before closing his eyes. I went to the guest room and plopped down on the bed. I wouldn't be sleeping, at least not yet. I had research to do.
Oh,
I grabbed
yeah.
my phone and began Googling the address of the house, trying to find the names of the past owners. It didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for. It was a picture of a newspaper clipping from the 1950s.
1950s.
The headline read, "The Gruesome Fredericks Murders." I gasped aloud when I read
Fredericks murders. The kid was murdered.
the first line of the article. When Mr. Fredericks found out that Mrs. Fredericks had been having an affair, he went into a murderous rage and shot her and the two children,
Oh.
Penelope and Alexander. I scrolled further and saw a picture of the very house I was sitting in. taken many years earlier. Tony hadn't been lying.
Was she gonna tell the parents about this?
There really was a ghost in this house. That night, I struggled to sleep as I listened to Tony talking to his ghost friend down the hall. Once again, I tiptoed down the hall and peeked into Tony's room. He had a ball in his hand that he threw across the room. When an invisible force threw the ball back to him, I gasped and took off running back to the guest room,
'Cause that's Alexander. It's a real ghost.
locking the door behind me. The next morning, I didn't bother to make small talk with Tony's parents when they got home. I just gathered my things and got ready to leave.
She said, I'm out of here.
The ghost thing didn't bother you too much, did it? Tony's mom asked suddenly. I mean, at least
So the parents do know about the ghost thing. And they not trying to do nothing about it?
he has a friend. I just stared at her in shock before walking out the door, promising myself I would never be back. In high school, I worked at a toy store to make extra money. It was a pretty stress-free job, that is, except for when it came to the holidays. Parents would come in demanding some new popular toy, and if we didn't have any left, they would go crazy. There was lots of yelling and rushing around. One night, a few days before Christmas, I was in the back room doing inventory. I needed to find out what we would need to order more of so we would have a full stock for Christmas. I knew that after Christmas we would be just as busy with people doing returns and exchanges. I was so busy that I lost track of time, and before I knew it, it was 9 p.m. Wow, we closed 15 minutes ago. Why didn't anybody come and get me? I said to myself. I walked out into the store only to see that it was completely empty and the lights were off. Hello? I called out, but nobody answered. My coworkers had completely forgotten about me and left. Oh well, I couldn't really blame them. The stress was getting to all of us. All of a sudden, I heard a child's high-pitched laugh from somewhere nearby. I spun around, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. Hello?
Heck nah. As soon as I saw that it was empty, I would have left. I would have been like, alright, they left me, I'm gone.
I called out, wondering if someone had lost their kid. Play with me, play with me, the voice said. Something cold rushed past me, causing me to jump. Who's there? I asked, my heart beating faster and faster. Something wasn't right. The sound of the high-pitched laughter filled the whole store. There was more than one child. Play with us! Play with us! They were chanting.
A whole bunch of
screamed
kids.
as something slammed into a shelf of Barbie dolls, knocking them over. Something cold came out of nowhere and pushed me down. It felt like I had been shoved by a grown man. Please, just leave me alone, don't hurt me, I begged, the terror obvious in my voice. The children, creatures, whatever you called them, they just mocked me. Don't hurt me, they chanted, erupting in crazy, high-pitched laughter. I pulled myself up and began sprinting towards the door.
See, if I was her, I would start swinging my arm, swinging everywhere. Don't touch me. Why she ain't carrying no taser? I would have had a taser on me. Start tasing the air wherever they was.
Not so fast, we're just having fun, a voice called out again and again, and I was slammed to the floor. The laughter got louder and louder until I couldn't think. I couldn't feel, and I was sure I was going to die.
Oh,
Just
heck
as quickly
no.
as it started, it stopped, and the store got quiet. I pulled myself to my feet and took off into the night. I never returned to the store, and I never told anyone what happened. I know nobody would have believed me. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out...
So thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned. I'll be back with more videos, and I'm out.